Very kind words. As a son of a Technion graduate, I know how that feels. I grew up in a house where Technion was sacred. I brought my father with me today, and I brought the third generation. They're arguing between themselves who gets to carry the torch for the next generation on the way in here. I'll tell you the story of how I got into the Technion before we proceed with the rest of the lecture, because I don't think I told this ever before in the Technion. I was one of those kids that actually was always in a rush. I was a student of the theory of relativity in a very young age, and I said that if you run fast enough, you can beat time. At the age of about 15 and a half, I figured out I had enough of high school. We were living in Argentina. I decided to apply to all the major universities in the US and filed applications to Harvard and Yale, Stanford, Caltech, you name it. And I started getting accepted towards the end of that year, end of my, I think it was junior year, it's the end of my 11th grade. And my mom got really scared. It's a 15-year-old kid in America, she saw all the movies, you know, all these things, bad things that will happen to me. And so my parents conspired on a vacation in Israel to try and convince me to see if the Israeli universities will accept me. And we tried with the minors first. We went to Tel Aviv University. And it usually works here. And I asked to start at the following year, the following academic year. This was early February. And we went to the dean of the math school. They didn't have a computer science department yet, so it was in the math school. And he asked me to do all kinds of tests, and they might accept me towards the following year. I did not impress him with anything I brought in with papers and everything else. It just didn't work. So the following Friday, I think, we drove up to the Technion, and my dad, who was a businessman and still is a businessman, taught me my first lesson in negotiations. He said, look, we made a mistake with Tel Aviv University. You asked to get applied to the next year, and you didn't show enough that you really want to take it, and so they were negotiating from that position. When we get to the Technion, you should tell them you want to start immediately on this semester. And then they'll accept you to next year. He said, I did. We come in, we get to the Technion, the overall dean for the whole school accepts me to a meeting. We show my scores for the high school, advanced placement courses, you name it, everything else. He looks at the grades, looks at the recommendations, he says, so what do you want? I said, I want to start immediately. He says, okay, we have a semester. It starts in 2 weeks. Come in. So my parents left back to Argentina. They left me here in Technion. My revenge at my dad was that 6 weeks later, I sent him a letter. I said, I don't know why you made this institute so mythical. It's so easy. He never forgave me for that letter. But I got to tell you, I think Technion reflects Israel to a degree, and I know you came here to hear about electric cars, and I know some of you even will buy electric cars, and I will sell you electric cars in about 20 minutes, but I want to reflect upon the role that this institute actually has and how the generations of Israel really reflect on the Technion's symbiotic relation with Israel and what we need to do in my eyes when we move forward. My dad is an immigrant into Israel, came in from Iraq, was very young, at a very young, tender age. His parents were told that if he wants to keep getting the education he got in Iraq, they need to send him away from the family to be brought up in an institute here in Haifa. And so that was what we did in the early days. We built upon a legacy of the first generation of Israel that built this sacred institute. The first generation pretty much had to invent everything. We're a generation, and your father is one of these. I don't call them engineers. They didn't learn here how to be engineers. They were brought up to be Imagineers. They were taught two disciplines. One is you have to imagine the impossible. and then you have to engineer towards it. And these Imagineers actually had invented a country, a state, a nation, out of nothing, which feels to most people who graduate from Technion like pretty much every lab you have here. You invent something out of nothing. And that generation had to take every resource we had. And these were the smart kids that got in and were thrown into the system and were mixed in to create the kul hituch, the sort of the melting pot of Israel. You take a kid like that, you throw him into the military. I think you start in the military in the early 60s. That first and second generation, Dor Hakama v'Kumemiyut of Israel, were unbelievable. My father graduated, I was here, so I graduated twice. I was here when I was 0 to 4, and I was here when I was 15 to 18. My father graduated, and his first task, and I remember we had a great conversation. We started 4 companies together, and I asked him once, what was your biggest achievement in life? And I was expecting to hear something, the companies that were created, this or that. And he said, my first project when I came back from Technion was my greatest achievement in life. Graduated in 1972, and his first task was actually to build a wireless cellular network in the peninsula called Sinai. In over a year, they built a network that lasted throughout a war. And that kind of an achievement, imagine today you take a first-year graduate, a bachelor's out of the Technion, and you say, you're going to be tasked with the most important network for the defense ministry of Israel. Thank you very much for graduating right now. Here's your task. We wouldn't even think about it today, all right? Just the committees on deciding who's going to be the head of that group would take longer than building the network. But that generation actually had a tremendous impact because we knew all of our resources had to be pulled together in one country and actually made into a punch, and we had to punch through. Because otherwise we wouldn't survive. It was a question of survival. And we punched through. We meaning them. Punched through. And it's the science, it's the engineering thought, it's the discipline, it's the way of thinking that actually got Israel through those formative years. Once we've been through those years, you actually see a whole new generation of people who also grew here that formed, basically opened the arm and created sort of the fingers that were extending the economy of Israel, because we realized it's not going to be just an engineering task, it's going to be an economic war. And your father actually symbolized that by moving from the discipline of engineering to the discipline of Ministry of Economy. It's going to be an economic war to form Israel as a force that actually has sustaining right in the Middle East. And we formed companies, the likes of Elbit and Tadiran and all these companies that really took all the discipline that was formed effectively in defending Israel and exported it out and built an economy on a very, very small number of companies that really took the talent and brought it out to the rest of the world and brought the money back into Israel to build it again. And I think that third generation, or second generation if you want, Israel, is depending if you count from -1 or from 1. And computer scientists, we know if you're a C programmer, you start at 0, and if you're not, you start at 1. But in that sense, you sort of had that second generation build an economy. Then came my generation. And we became the generation of me, generation of 1. Not bad people. It's the Gil Shveds and the Shlomo Kremels and the guys who came out of these organizations. When I came out from Technion after I'd graduated and gone through a bit of a car accident and everything else that happened to me in my life, I went and recruited my dad out of Elbit. Most people told him he's crazy. To leave an established company, go form a company with his son. I was 21 years old, 22 years old, and there was not even a solid idea of what we were trying to do. We just said, let's go do something together. And when you start in that kind of a direction, we were a generation in the sense that sort of splintered the economy, and a lot of venture capitalists funded it, and the end result were a ton of companies. Some of them were extremely successful. And we created I think, in a sense, better place, and maybe not better, Quicksoft and what became top tier, created a metaphor that was, or a template that a lot of the kids actually followed afterwards. Come start a company, 2-3 years later, you sell it, you get $100 million, they start a movie, a TV program about you, and it became a template, and to a certain degree, it had rights and it had all People didn't need permits to go start a company and form them. But if you look at the end result 20 years later, we created, to a certain degree, a secluded economy in the middle of Israel with sort of satellites in different places. We created huge separation in culture between the haves and have-not. We created not a single big entity. We don't have a Nokia. We don't have a massive company. I mean, barring the likes of MDocs, et cetera, but they're all fantastic companies, but they're not, unlike Nokia, which we laugh about. Nokia is sort of a company that found a country. We have a lot of great companies that have all the valid rights to be proud, but they're not sustaining, and they will not sustain a major wave coming in from China and India, where you get 1 million, 1.5 million engineering students to graduate every year. And so when I got into the question about what's the fourth generation, I had all that in mind. I was at SAP, I was about to run a company that was one of the largest companies in my industry, the third largest company in the software industry. A great career at the end of 40 years. I started early, I got to that point early. And I indeed got a question, what are you going to do to make the world a better place? At 39, do not listen when they ask you these kinds of questions. It's an early onset of midlife crisis to figure out that the next version of SAP and the next version of SAP and the next version of SAP is not going to make any difference in this world. And at the end of the day, most people here at the back, I hope that when you graduate, it's not just about what you're going to do to make yourself do better, but also what you're going to do to make the world a better place. You're granted an immense set of tools in the 4 years you spend here. And the question is what you're going to do with it. I always said that I will never use 70% of the classes I would study during my bachelor's degree. The problem is you never know which 70%, so you have to go to all classes. It's not true. I think I've used every single class to date. I just didn't know that I will use it over time. And what I didn't know is that what you get here is an immense discipline beyond computer science or electric engineering or chemical industry, whatever it is that you study and you think is the degree you get. What you get in Technion is the ability to look at a problem, as big as it may be, break it into pieces, solve every part of it, put it back together again. And with the exception of usually one screw, it's all together. That discipline is the discipline we carry into this world. I honed it over a period of time at places like SAP and in other places, but when I was asked that, how are you going to make the world a better place by 2020, I actually ran a thought process that I studied from a great professor at Stanford called Jim Collins, who studied the most successful companies on earth. He actually went out and looked at what differentiates between good companies and great companies. And he only found 13 great companies existed in the last 67 years. His definition of great companies requires us to have a long-term view on the success of the company. He looked at companies that ran somewhat in similar level of success, performance-wise, as the rest of their peers in the industry, and then something happened, and for the next 15 years, they had 3x returns on the rest of their industry. 15 years, not one good year, not 2 years, not one product, 15 years. Ended up that of all the S&P 500s, I think maybe 13 companies had it. And he said there's a magic moment there. What happens at the magic moment? And he found out that there's no simple formula. But there is a confluence of 3 effects that actually happens at that point in time. First of all, you have to find out what the company, and that applies to people as well, is really passionate about. What makes the organization, what makes the individual tick every day? Then you have to find out what you're the best in the world at. And for every individual in the world, there is something that you're the best in the world at. And if you don't know what it is, shut down the aperture a bit, and a bit more, and finally within there, you will find something you're the best in the world at. Every single person, every single company, every organization. And there is an economic driver for every single one of us, something that makes us operate. If you find the cross-section between passion, what you're best in the world at, and the economic driver, you find what he called the hedgehog concept. See, hedgehogs know how to do only one thing, but they do it really, really well. They get to become a ball of pins whenever a fox tries to eat them. With a lot of passion, they're really good at it, and the economic driver in their case is survival. That combination of passion, best in the world at, and an economic driver is something that's very, very hard to find. And when I was trying to figure it out for myself, it took me a very long time to figure that answer. The interesting part about it is when I looked at it originally, I said, I'm great at software engineering. But what I'm passionate about is peace in the Middle East. And no matter how much I try to combine software with peace in the Middle East, I couldn't solve for peace in the Middle East with a piece of software. I had it wrong. What I was best in the world at was to take huge problems, huge engineering problems, break them into pieces, solve every one of the engineering pieces, and then reassemble it back again. And I learned that here when I was 16 years old. When I got to SAP, they became really big problems. And if any of you has never done an SAP implementation, you wouldn't know what I'm talking about, but if you did, I apologize. So how do you take a gigantic engineering problem and solve for peace in the Middle East? Still doesn't seem to be a combination that has any validity. So I looked at examples and I said, which countries in the Middle East we actually have a sustained peace, not because we've signed a peace treaty, but because we actually want to have peace and the other side wants to have peace. And the examples were in the Emirates. When you talk to the Bahrainians, you see why they don't have a problem with us, or Dubai and Abu Dhabi, at least till recently. It ends up that these guys figure it out. They're running out of oil. And when you run out of oil, you diversify your economy. If you had an economy that was based on digging holes into the ground to put a tree, and instead of that oil came out, you don't put any trees. You just dig holes and you get oil. When you diversify an oil economy, you get tourism, you get financial institutes, you get education, you get TV, you get a middle class. And if you have TV, you have to have freedom of speech. Al Jazeera. If you have financial institutes, you have to have transparency. If you have tourism, you can't hate foreigners because they're the economy. What you get is a modern society. It sort of creeps on you. You don't plan to get a modern society, it just happens. And when you get a modern society, you don't want war. The last thing you want is war. With the exception of Al Jazeera, that profits from it, the rest of their economy absolutely depends on peace. So they want peace strategically for them, not for us. So I figured out what you need to do is to bring the price of oil in a soft landing back to zero. Now that's a technology problem. So it ends up that my hedgehog concept was not an answer, it was a question. How do you run an entire country without oil by 2020 in a way that every country in the world can copy it with means that we have on the shelf, not by an edict, meaning not just in China, but by the forces of market economics? How do you turn on its head the two toughest industries to turn, oil and car? By the way, the last disruption in the car industry was 102 years ago. It was called the Ford Model T, 1908. And most of the engineers who worked on the Ford Model T no longer work in Ford. The magnitude of those two industries, $10 trillion a year. How do you disrupt $10 trillion a year in a span of 15 years? And if you wanted an economic driver, disrupting $10 trillion a year creates tremendous economic wealth for everybody involved. So how do you solve that technological problem? I tried everything that everybody knew. I read every book about biochemistry and biofuels. I was absolutely positively sure that we're going to be able to grow the oil that we need. I picked Israel as my site because I said if it works in Israel, it will work everywhere. And then I figured out the biofuel industry is by and large converting water and sugar in one form or another into energy. But when you actually research what's going on in the world, and in Israel in particular, we're turning energy into water, which would create kind of a stupid circle. Because every time you go from water to energy, energy to water, water, energy, energy to water, you lose energy in the process. After 6 months of that, I left that aside, failed semester one. Hydrogen. Absolutely positively sure hydrogen would be the answer. I was faster on that because I actually met a PhD from MIT about 3 months into my hydrogen quest of fuel cell cars. And you can imagine every book, the hydrogen economy, And 3 months into it, he reminded me of the second law of thermodynamics and of the fact that a hydrogen car is effectively an electric car that packages electrons in the form of molecules that are 2,000 times heavier, and nobody knows how to send them around. In other words, he said, you're trying to package email in FedEx envelopes and send it around. Even if you know how to open the envelope and read the email, when you figure out what you did, you're kind of stupid. Failed semester 2. That was it was a summer semester, it was short. The answer was electrons. The fundamentals are very simple. We all know them. It's, when I say them, most people say, yeah, it makes a ton of sense. If you take the first course in physics, you learn that you can't create energy, you can only convert energy. And so the best and cleanest conversion you can imagine is take a photon, convert it into electron, convert it into motion. At no point in time do you go through a molecule, and as a result of that, you get the highest form of energy efficiency. Straightforward. Now you got to build it. That's where you start arguing with physics, and arguing with physics is really, really tough because she doesn't move. And I started arguing with physics when I figured out the battery you can put into a car can take you 160 kilometers without altering the car, without giving up 2 seats, without giving up on speed, without giving up on the price. What you can fit in is about 100 miles, 160 kilometers. But I came back to the question from which we started, and that was, it has to be driven by market forces. Meaning, the question of how do you run an entire country without oil converts into a microeconomic question. How can you build a car that will be cheaper and more convenient for the consumer, for the single individual? Because if you tell somebody to do something for the environment, they will tell you most of the time that if it's more expensive or inconvenient, they would like their neighbors to go first. We know that. Numerous studies. So how do you build a car that's limited by 160 kilometers that would be convenient, yet the battery costs about $10,000? That's the starting point of the derivative question. And I can take you through a set of questions that we answer one after the other, and through the moments of aha that we had throughout this process. The bottom line was a separation between the car and the battery. We basically realized that the car battery is like oil, only it doesn't burn, it grinds. It's like your inkjet printer cartridge. Every time you print a page, you lose a bit of the cartridge. The battery is the same. Every time you drive 160 kilometers, you lose one coupon in a book of about 2,000. You get a book, it's got about 300,000 kilometers of coupons inside. Every time you drive, somebody takes a coupon. And by the end of it, the battery, which was 160 kilometers, is now 130 kilometers as it grinds down. And most people in the car industry call that a dead battery. After 300,000 kilometers, it's a dead battery. We actually said, why not separate between the car and the battery? You buy the car, you pay for the battery like you pay at a gas station. Every time you go in a gas station, you buy kilometers. You think you're buying liters of a liquid, but you're really buying kilometers. And we looked at the economics, and they suddenly became very interesting in the sense that the electric car without the battery costs the same to produce, and over time, like your plasma screens, they will cost less and less to produce, like a gasoline car. And the battery, plus the electrons it takes to refine them into kilometers, actually costs about half of what it costs to buy a liter of gasoline today in a gas station. You drove to Haifa, and then you figured out you got in on the wrong day, you got to drive back to Tel Aviv. You don't have time to charge, but you can go into a gas station and switch your battery. And we said, let's go switch batteries. And the entire car industry said, you can't do that. Impossible to do. What was amazing is I sat down with a car company who said they're going to build a car that knows how to drive itself, but they can't build a robot that will switch a battery underneath the car. So we went out and we built that battery. We've built it so well that we actually have a taxi station going in Tokyo right now that for the last 50 days has actually been switching batteries on taxis that are going 300 kilometers every day. Those taxis have been going for 10,000 kilometers in the last 6-7 weeks, nonstop. They switch, they go, they switch, they go. It takes 59 seconds to switch the battery. The goal was to go under a minute. We did 59.1 seconds. For something that can't be done, that's actually pretty decent. It is so much fun that some of the passengers are actually asking the driver to go through the switch station so that they can see that you really can't feel anything. Because you can't feel anything. And when you drive that taxi, when you go in that taxi in the streets of Tokyo, people point at it as if a UFO landed in the streets of Tokyo. And when I opened the window and looked out, I felt like an alien who came out of the future for these guys. But it's reality and it's today. 2.5, 3 years ago, when I wrote this whole thing on a piece of paper called a white paper, and I had version 1 and 10 and 11, I think version 11, I handed it out to most people around the world. And most of them told me that it's great that the young generation is thinking about problems like that. Pat on the back, move on. Only one true Imagineer, which happens to be the President of Israel, took the paper, asked me if I'm serious about it, called me up 2 days later, and said, please come to my office. What I didn't know is President Paris, between me handing him the paper and calling me into his office, handed the paper to 3 experts and asked them, can you read this paper and tell me what your opinion is? And all 3 came back and said, the guy's hallucinating. So he called me into his office and told his assistants, if they'd said it's obvious, we shouldn't worry about it. But if they all think he's hallucinating, that means he's onto something. He's pushing the envelope. And over a span of 2 weeks, I got asked to move from one place to the other in Israel, go from one minister to another minister, and another minister, and another office, another politician, another businessman. And in a 2 weeks period of time, we created enough interest that I get invited to the Prime Minister's office, Prime Minister Ulmer, circa December 2006. It's actually January 1st, 2007. You can imagine the context around that. And the Prime Minister says, look, I hear you have a great idea. Everybody tells me it's strategic for Israel. If we actually can get the world off of oil, we understand the strategic geopolitical implications for Israel. They also tell me you need $200 million. I want to remind you, I'm not a venture capitalist. So go find $200 million somewhere else, preferably outside Israel. Then I know you're a software guy, you're not a car guy. So figure out, you have to show me a CEO of a car company that is willing to build the car you're describing in your paper, not in one, but in volumes of millions. And if you show me a car guy and $200 million, I will let you spend the money in Israel. I went back to Paris and I said, you know, here's what the Prime Minister said. Great. Obviously, I've missed something. He said, no, look, that's how things get started. I said, okay, so you start a ministry in the government, get a budget for $200 million. I'll give you names of 3 people who are going to do this, and you go. He said, no, Shai, you got it absolutely wrong. That's not how things get started. See, governments don't do anything new. Individuals do new things. Governments try and get away from disturbing you in the process, and when you're successful, we tax you. So great, so here's the list of people, convince them to go find the money, do this thing, and he said, what do you mean list of people? You have to do it. And I said, no, I have a job, I have a career, I'm at SAP, I'm going to be the CEO in about 3 weeks' time. He said, well, it must be a great job, great career. Can you explain to me, what is that job that you'd prefer returning to that job and not save your country and the world for? Jewish guilt works 100% of the time. And I said, let me think about it. 3 days later, I quit SAP. We didn't have a car, we didn't have $200 million. I quit SAP. They didn't believe me, so I had to quit twice. And the third time, by the third time I quit, they realized the guy's actually serious. In between my first time quitting and the third time quitting, we actually met with 2 car companies. President Paris invited them to Davos. The story is well documented in Startup Nation, a great book. And we got 2 car guys to come over and meet with us. We invited 5, the top 5 car companies in the world. 3 of them were getting ready for their congressional hearing 18 months later. They wouldn't show up. The 2 that did show up were very interesting. The vice chairman of a car company came in and we started, President Paris says, look, we decided in Israel we're going to get off oil. We have this strategic, it's important, oil funds terror, da-da-da-da-da-da. He pitches and pitches and pitches. After 5 minutes, that guy says, stop, I read the paper. The guy's hallucinating. Says, Shai's crazy. Can't build that car. let me give you discount on hybrids for the entire country so you don't do this project. And for 25 minutes, he's trying to convince the president not to do the project, that Israel shouldn't do an electric car project, and they would get a discount on hybrids for the entire country. When he leaves, Carlos Ghosn of Renault comes in, and Paris starts again. Now here's greatness, true greatness. Another president anywhere else in the world pitched it for the first guy, got a no, such a resounding no. He steps back in his chair and says, Shai, why don't you pitch it now, right? Paris felt like he failed the sales pitch. He's going to try harder. And he went at it the second time with a lot more vigor. 5 minutes, he's going, he's convincing. And after 5 minutes, Ghosn raised the hand and says, I read the paper. That was a bad omen. And he says, Shai's absolutely right. I got the car, I got the battery, we're going to be your partner. Paris looks at him and says, what about hybrids? And Ghosn says a sentence, we haven't figured out what he said, but it always works. He said, hybrids are like mermaids. When you want a fish, you get a woman. When you need a woman, you get a fish. I haven't figured out why it's funny, but it's really funny. Now, at the end of the day, Ghosn was true to his word. Ghosn has put 15% of Renault Nissan's R&D budget over the last 4 years to build a lineup of cars, electric cars. They're just nothing short of amazing. We now have reviews by news reporters. I drove the car a few months back, but the news reporters were astonished by the following fact. That when the car starts, it says 160 kilometers. And when you drive 10 kilometers, it actually says 150 kilometers. When you drive another 20 kilometers, it says 130 kilometers. In other words, we have a car that actually goes 160 kilometers on a battery. It's a full car. It's not a two-seater. It's a full 5-seat car. It's actually a very long car. It's as long as the Audi A6. It goes fast, and it will be cheaper than the equivalent gasoline car. 2.5 years later, the car is reality. We Imagineered it. We started with Renault. They argued that we'll need 2,500 cars a year. And I came in and said, no, you don't understand. We need 100,000 cars a year. And we went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And finally they said, look, there isn't demand for 100,000 cars, electric cars a year in the entire world. How are you going to take 100,000 cars in Israel? And I said, you don't understand the business model. And we explained to them the business model. And we sat down with all the strategists from Renault. And we took in what I learned in Economics 1 here and Economics 2 here. And we explained a business model to the strategists of Renault. When the meeting was done, there was lots of silence in the room. And the head of product for Renault looked at his guys and says, gentlemen, he doesn't have a demand problem, he has a supply problem. We will not be able to make enough cars for this gentleman. The argument today at Renault is not whether we'll do thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. There's an argument between two groups whether we'll do hundreds of thousands or millions a year. We figured out a model by which we will tip this industry. We believe we will tip the industry. Mark my words, I know it's going to be public, but I believe that by 2015, more electric cars will come on the road on that year in Israel than gasoline cars. 5 years ahead of what we said. Now, it will take quite some time to clear up the market, but we believe tipping will happen in 2015. If I'm wrong, it's by a year. Why? Because we're on an exponential curve. One exponent is going down, it's the cost of the battery, and one exponent is going up, the price of oil. And the best thing you can do as an investor is bet on the inevitable. The worst thing that can happen is you got to wait a year. And I sat down at Google before they went public, and they showed me a graph of the searches at Google. And I don't know if you've ever seen that, but they marked it on their wall. Every night, somebody would come and mark how many searches were conducted on Google. And every time they got to the edge of the wall, they did a 10x log down. And they start again. And they start again. Then they started measuring how long it takes them between going down the entire wall and the next time they have to go. And it was about 3 months. So they used to tell investors, if you don't like our revenue model, wait 3 months, it'll be 10x. When you're on two exponents, revenues and cost, if you don't like it, wait. We're on the inevitable. What we did between then and now, we converted the paper into reality. We did it all in Israel. I don't think most people understand, but we got about 1,000 engineers working in Israel on this project, of which I would argue probably 70, 80% got educated here. In all forms of engineering skills that you can imagine. 150 of them work for me directly, and the rest are working through tens of companies across Israel. We took innovation from every form of imagination you can bring in. That battery that knows how to go down and up is latched with the hooks from the bottom of the F-16. When the car industry said, we don't know how to do this, the guy who built the robot that knows how to put the bombs, remember they're 1-ton bombs at the Air Force, came in and said, oh, we know how to do it. When they said it can't be done in 4 minutes, he said, oh, actually, we release the battery with the bomb in a split second. If we don't do it in a split second, we miss. So I said, but what happens when you do a split second? He says, it shakes. I said, okay, can you make it not shake? He said, we'll do it in 4 seconds. If we do it in 4 seconds, nobody notices. So he put the same hook, slowed it down to 4 seconds. When I got called by the guys who were trying to do Formula 1 races with electric cars, they said, could you do it in 12 seconds, which is the time it takes us to switch the tires? I said, we can do it in less. We're basically offering them to do a race between an electric car and a gasoline car. Not for a short distance, for an hour and a half, just to prove the point. Now, those innovations, we've built software that sits inside the car that has to answer a very, very fundamental problem. We talked yesterday about that issue. An electric car is an amazing device. It is about 5 times the electric demand of an entire household, but only for about 30 minutes. If you let every individual plug their car when they come home at the end of the day, or plug their car at the beginning of the day when they come to work, you get a spike of demand that would require the Israeli electric utilities to build $5 billion worth of generation and transmission. Half the cost of the grid to date. On the other hand, if you let the cars plug, the electric utility decide who needs the electricity right now, because not all of them need it for the first half hour of their parking. They're parked for 22 hours most days. The electric utility knows how to tell us exactly how many cars can charge at every moment, and as a result of that, you don't need to add a single generator or a single transmission improvement to the entire country. As a matter of fact, we reduce the needs for generation because those batteries become effectively the uninterrupted power supply of the country. 40 times the amount of generation. Imagine a red button on the Ministry of Defense desk where if, God forbid, something happened in the middle of a war and we lost power, we press the button and the power in those batteries becomes the safety net for Israel. How much is that worth to a country? We spent, to date, almost 1 billion shekels. Mostly on research and development, mostly in Israel, on this project. We're about to spend another 1 billion shekels on putting all that network into the ground in Israel. One of the largest public works effort that was funded absolutely by private money. Not a single shekel from the government. We never asked for money. We never got any money. Which is, if you don't ask, you don't get. I followed the guidance of the Prime Minister. He said, you got to go out and do it yourself. Which means we expect to get taxed. We expect to get taxed when we're successful. The implications of our success are significantly bigger than just one company. In the last 45 days, Vice Mayor of Beijing, Minister of Science and Technology of China, the head of the electric utility for China, various different people from China have come to Israel for 36 hours, one by one, to Piglilot of all places, to test electric cars with the Israeli model. The head of the group, State Grid, the electric utility, it's just the largest company on earth. 1.2 million people get electricity from them. They know them by name. 1.2 billion, sorry, get their electricity. He wanted to see deployment in a city. We took him to the largest city in Israel. He drove up to Jerusalem, met the head of the mayor's office, the director general for Jerusalem. He asked him, how big is your city? And he said, it's the biggest city in Israel. He said, so how many people? He said, 800,000 people. He said, funny, I have 1.5 million employees. Now, when China comes to Israel to figure out how we do public works, how we do infrastructure projects, how we do disruptions, China does 20 million cars this year. China next year will make more cars than the US and Europe combined. And for those of you who haven't been to Beijing lately, it used to be that you couldn't see from one side of the street to the other side of the street, not because it was such a wide street, because you just can't see anymore because of the smog. You no longer can see from inside the street to the gas station in the side of the street. It's that thick. Of 365 days a year, at least 250 are declared unbreathable by any other country in the world. This is the air, version Tel Aviv, version Haifa, on steroids, on rapid deployment, on rapid growth. And they can't stop. You just can't stop. When China comes here, figure out how to get off oil. When Europe and the US, and we got 15 different teams from different countries every week visiting Piglilot in Israel to see how it gets done. And we have 25 car guys in Israel to visit us in one seminar last week. And when we have all these things happening, Israel's become the ground zero of the change. And it defines Israel. We spoke before. I was invited by one of the ambassadors in one of our European countries, our ambassador in a European country, to speak to the government about what we do. And we came out and he said, I want to thank you. It was the first time I was asked to the government not to speak about the Palestinian problem. First time we came in to educate them, not the other way around. It's the first time we get a story that we can tell outside. I think that defines Israel, defines the role that we have to play. Israel is an amazing lab. It's an extension of the Technion. You couldn't do this outside. I tried. Not that I'm saying that you couldn't do it because I didn't try. I tried in other countries. But you don't get this kind of an environment to go test a project like you get in Israel. You don't get the sense that there's a dialogue, an ongoing dialogue. By the way, you also don't get the criticism as you get in Israel. But it's good. It's free publicity. There's not an Israeli in Israel that doesn't have at least two opinions about why our cars will work or not work. And they switch their opinion every once in a while. Now, that creates a tremendous experimental ground with unbelievable talent that once harnessed to solve a problem, does so in ways that you can't find anywhere else in the world. So I'll challenge you as the president. What is your hedgehog concept? What's the passion of Technion? What are you best in the world at? And you are the best in the world at a lot of different things, but what are you really the best in the world at? And what's the economic driver? Because I remember I came here 25 years ago to this hall, and it looked the same. I do remember that I went to Stanford, and they've made in the last 25 years about $10 billion. So there is an economic driver for success. And I actually think that there is a way to look at Technion through fresh eyes. There is an ability to galvanize this tremendous force of students through passion. There is an ability to find what this institute is really, truly best in the world at. And if you put all of it together, there is an economic driver that transcends just seats in a theater and transcends just growth of buildings. It changes the world. This place does change the world. And if we find a way to actually cross these three in the Technion, we will change Israel as well. The relevancy of the Technion to Israel is beyond just a number of graduates at the end of the year.
Our products are here on this stage. This is how we change the world.
Absolutely, but we can do that. We have to get away from a certain sickness that actually engulfs us when we ask this question. We're engulfed with cynicism and skepticism. I want to put a number in front of you that will shock you. The scope of our project, the network that we've asked, the $200 million is effectively one gas tank per car in the country. 1 week of gasoline for Israel. When I came into the government to ask the government to get away from oil, I asked for 1 week of gasoline. And I was told to go find it myself. That's how we're going to shame the rest of the world once we've proven it in Israel. Because, trust me, there is not a president in the world that will be able to sustain a headline that said, we've offered to take your country off of oil for the price of 1 gasoline week. And your president said no. Once we've proven it in Israel, we're going to do it in the rest of the world. What we need to do is to get away from the cynicism and skepticism that when somebody comes up with credentials, with papers, with the ability to actually say, I know how to do it, with the willingness to put their life on the line, we have to stop saying, it's not going to get done, the guy's a crook, he's in it for money, he's in it, last guy who designed a government office for money must be an idiot. When we let ourselves fall into that trap, we rob ourselves of a better future. That's what we need to do. We need to apply the scientific rigor to test an idea like that. But we also have to let go of the cynicism and the skepticism. And we have to let ourselves fall into the belief that we actually can be changing the world to a better place. We can change. We can become the change. And if we do so, with the powers in the back seats, we'll change here, we'll change Israel, and we'll change the world. Thank you very much. Yeah, so what we actually do, so the question is, will we build the stations? We've designed the stations, and we shop the actual construction, if you want, of the station and the installation of the station into partners in each one of the countries. We have the Japanese station, which you saw, I think, behind me, was built by a Japanese company. We've got a European company that's building those stations for Europe, et cetera, et cetera. So the design was done in Israel by an Israeli firm. The engineering was done in Israel by an Israeli firm. The construction is actually happening outside. The thing that really saddens me more than anything else, and I think that's what we lost in the cynicism. When we came in the beginning, we said we have two propositions to the government. One is to get off of oil. The other one is to build an industry around that idea. We brought in up to even a factory for cars. I won't tell you the whole story. It's a very, very sad story. But the bottom line was car companies got loans from governments to put new factories, in particular innovative cars, to the tune of about $100, $150 million to get a factory like that. That loan is about a quarter of what Intel got to put what became the chip industry of Israel, their fab back whatever years ago. The sense at the time was that no politician would be willing to take the risk of associating their name with a failure. And as a result of that continuous criticism on our politicians, they back away from taking any risk. And giving a loan to Renault to build a car that seemed at that time to be crazy, and today is the leading car in the world. It's truly becoming award-winning innovation. So sort of think of iPads or iPhones or iPods, multiply that by a factor of 1,000, that's what you get in value it creates. We missed the opportunity. We missed it for two reasons. We couldn't get the loan because people were afraid to associate themselves with the idea. And we needed, the factory was designed to be in Bet Shean. It was supposed to create 50,000 jobs, blue-collar jobs in supply chain across Israel. We couldn't get the train tracks between Bet Shean and the port of Haifa in time for the factory. As a matter of fact, I heard from people who said, we can find a way to give you the money, we just can't find a way to put the tracks on. I'm not sure if you know, but in Israel there's a famous question: if a train leaves the station in Tel Aviv at 8 o'clock in the morning, and another train leaves the station in Jerusalem at 9 o'clock in the morning, how long would it take to put the tracks between the two places? The answer for that in Israel is infinity. We couldn't get the tracks to be put in place. Now, the same way when we're coming in today, when I come in to build a switch station, it's a robot. It's 5,000 pieces. It can be built anywhere in the world. We have governments that are coming in and saying, we, as a government, will fund your station for the next 6 years as a export financing if you build it in our country. And they buy the jobs. They're saying, we're sitting on a lot of money, we're going to give you the money, you're giving it back to us 6 years later, just put the factory here. I don't even dare asking the Israeli government, because somebody will come up and say this guy who's hallucinating is trying to get government money to fund his idea. So we don't even ask. And the jobs actually, unfortunately, go outside. It's the result of cynicism. That's what I was trying to point to. So the question is on safety inside the car. Could you make the cars safer for drivers? The good news about an electric car, it's a big computer. And as a big computer, you can do everything you do on a computer. You can sort of play with parameters. For example, if you drive in a gasoline car and there's an accident ahead of you, half a kilometer away, there's no way to mechanically block you from driving at a faster speed. But with the computer, you can just download a parameter that says, during the next 2 miles, you can only go 80 kilometers an hour. You can download a profile to your kid, for example, who takes the car after 12, will not be able to drive more than 90 kilometers an hour, other than 5 seconds of acceleration to get out of an accident. We actually record everything that happens inside the car. We keep it in the car, so don't worry. We say we will know how to answer every question other than, where is my husband? The reality is we will record the last 5-10 minutes of every drive, which means we enable the police, for example, if the laws of the country, the privacy laws of the country, say that it is more important to find out somebody who hit a person in a hit-and-run accident than to keep their privacy. Because if they hit a person and drove off, it's important to find this guy before he does it again. And that's, again, it's a court's decision, not our decision. We can find out what happened at the accident. We can play back in 3 dimensions every car that was in the area. If he was slowed down or accelerated, somebody cut him off. It can be replayed. All these things we're able to do. The question will be effectively, what would the laws of the land dictate us? But we'll enable it to happen. We actually think that even in economic terms, we would like to keep our subscribers alive because they'll continue to pay. And so it's an interest for us to make these cars very, very safe. We see a lifelong relationship with them, not to mention the fact that we do save lives. There are actually twice as many people killed from respiratory problems from the tailpipes of cars than killed by the bumpers of cars in car accidents. Twice as many people. Now, if somebody came in Israel and said, I found a project that will save all 350 lives from car accidents, would he be sent out to find budget on his own? Yes. We're saving twice as many people on this project. Thank you all very much.
Well, I thank you very much. We definitely share the vision and also some of the experiences that you had with the government. This concludes today's program and also concludes this meeting of the Board of Governors. See you here next year.
Do